And all of our platforms and article will also be published after this event if you would prefer to share something in text form. Okay. Hello and welcome to the final Facts First PH research briefing. This is the 11th research briefing that we've had since we started the Facts First PH initiative. So we have 3 days to go until the big election, and the research briefings are really here to help us understand and find insight from all the things that are happening online. As you all know, disinformation, misinformation, fake news, propaganda, all of this are all happening right now online. And we started these series of research briefings to really make sense of it all so that we're able to understand what's going on in our online landscape. So thank you very much to everyone who's joining us this morning. My name is Happy, and I'll be moderating today's research briefing. For today's final Facts First PH research briefing, we will be showcasing 3 research reports. The authors of all these reports are here with us this morning to be presenting their own work. After every presentation from the authors, we will be having a short Q&A session. So again, for those of you that are listening in and here joining us this morning, you can send in your questions on the chat box. So again, thank you also to all our partners who are also cross-posting this on their social media accounts. So this is live right now, happening right now, and the recording of this one will remain in the Rappler social media account. So if you want to go back to any of the presentations, you can do so by just re-watching the recording. We also will be having stories, articles about these research reports, and those will be released after this event. So before I call on our first presenters for this morning, I would just like to talk a little bit about what hashtag FactsFirstPH is all about. So in case you missed it, FactsFirstPH was launched early this year. This brought together over 100 media and civil society groups, as well as church groups, to come together and take a stand to protect the facts and move towards a healthier and safer public space online. So we're here again with us, joining us today, part of the Facts First PH initiative. We have the research layer. These researchers are really here, like what I mentioned earlier, to make sense of all the fact checks that we have been doing and the activity and behavior that we see online. So if you're interested in the Facts First PH initiative, you can just check out the hashtag Facts First PH, and you can see when you click on that hashtag all the fact checks that have been produced since we launched early this year. So to open with the presentation. So again, we have 3 research reports that we'll be discussing today. So the first one, the title of the work is Bursts of Anti-Robredo Posts Partially Driven by Groups with Short-Lived Political Activities. So this research report was written by the author, Professor Prince Javier. He's a PhD student and teaching fellow at the Asian Institute of Management. Currently, he is a data scientist at Docwity, a startup that develops a knowledge sharing platform for doctors in Southeast Asia. He's also the co-founder of Bridge 360 IT Solutions, a tech startup in the Philippines that develops technology solutions for small and medium-scale enterprises, as well as for social good. So let's welcome on screen Professor Prince Javier.
Great, thanks, Happy. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen. So I'll head straight to it. So I want to talk about the method first. So what's the data? Well, what happened was Rappler collected some Facebook posts via a web crawler. And among these Facebook posts, we selected around 24 million posts from January 2019 to January 2020. And these correspond to around 8,900 Facebook groups and around 4.4 million users. So these are the posts that we analyzed, and we're going to show the results to you later. So in terms of models, I'm not going to deep dive into the technical details of these, but we had three main models. So the first one was a topic model, which was a way for us to categorize the posts into different topics. We were particularly interested in topics about politics. Then the second one was a sentiment model, and this identifies if a post was negative or positive. And finally, we had a clustering model, which categorized Facebook groups based on the trends in political activity. So we were interested in groups that had a decaying political activity versus groups that had stable or consistent political activity through time. In a nutshell, our analysis will show we focus on these four things. So first is we focus on Robredo, Marcos, and Duterte related posts to limit the scope of our analyses, especially that these are the political figures that make the headlines and that anecdotic in terms of like our experiences, we feel that these are the kinds of people that that have like polarizing posts about them. So we focused on these three. Then we looked at the trends in political posts, specifically the trends in sentiment. So which of those were positive and how many, of those were negative and how many over time. Then we looked at polarization of groups. And finally, we looked at specific groups that drove the anti or pro posts towards either Robredo, Marcos, or Duterte. Right, so let's start with trends in sentiment. So here we're showing like three charts. So the first one is Robredo, the second is Marcos, and the one below, that's Duterte. And these are the counts of anti and pro Marcos posts over time. So the anti posts are in red and the pro posts are in green. So I also indicated here the May elections and then the COVID lockdown. Now, okay, next. So one thing that we notice immediately is there are peaks in the number of posts. So if you look at Robredo related posts, there are peaks in negative posts here, for example, and then here's like a large, high peak of negative posts. But there's also like a peak of positive posts there, but not as high as the negative posts. And then you have another peak here. Same with Marcos, but it's more of like positive peaks for Marcos. So here, and then you have here and there. Duterte, the peaks are not as pronounced, but if you look closely, there are these kinds of like peaks. So we wanted to understand like what are the reasons for these peaks. So we'll show that later. Now, the second trend that we wanted to focus here is after the COVID lockdown. So this was around March 2020. There were some changes in the number of positive and negative posts. So in particular, you will notice in particular for Marcos and Duterte, contrary to like my hypothesis. So my hypothesis was like, oh, there's going to be a lot of negative posts because of how they handled the lockdown. Contrary to that, it seemed that there is a slight increase even in positive posts towards Duterte. And there is a much larger increase of positive posts towards Marcos. There's some slight increase for Robredo, but it's not really as pronounced as what's happening with Marcos and Duterte related posts. So let's focus first on Robredo. So it turns out that a lot of these peaks were because of some certain political events. So for example, here, that peak was because of Duterte saying something about Ocho Derecho. So this was like in March 2019, before the May elections. And further validating that, I looked at the top keywords that people posted So both from the positive side and from the negative side here. And from the negative side, you can see like there's a mention of Ocho Diretso, Banat Opposition, and Duterte. So people were talking about this news. Now, this next peak here, it's related to what happened in October 2019, which was there was a recount happening because of Marcos, like there was an electoral protest of sorts, and then Marcos wanted a recount to check if the actual numbers of voters were right. And so it turns out that after the recount, Robredo like widened the lead. So there was a peak in like positive posts, and you can see here that positive posts were talking about the electoral protest, panalo, nanalo. Meanwhile, there was also a surge in negative posts. So this is about Robredo, right? There was also a surge, but a lot of these were like name calling or like calling Robredo fake, peking, things like that. And then this is the tallest peak. And it was when Robredo was like appointed as co-chair in an agency that would like come up with a drug report on the war on drugs, and it was called ICAD. So there was like a large number of positive and negative posts, but the number of negative posts were much higher. So they were talking about ICAD, but there were mention of like fake, lugaw, things like that. January 2020 was when Robredo released the report, and she mentioned that it was like a drug, it was a failure. So in terms of Marcos related posts, there was a positive spike here, and that's related to recount. So the pro Marcos people, they had their own kind of bubble that kind of put a positive twist on the recount. And so there was like a positive jump there. And this one is another peak, and this was about the influencer Francis Leo Marcos. And apparently this influencer was arrested. And a lot of pro Marcos posts were like about rejoicing or celebrating this arrest. And then interestingly, these last few peaks were actually about the birthday of Bongbong Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos. So I didn't really know it, but it turns out that they have birthdays in September. So they were talking about birthday. So when I was looking at this, why is there a birthday? Where's the happy birthday? So it's because of Bongbong Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos. But the anti-Marcos posts were during that time, they were talking about martial law, dictador, never again. And so lastly is we want to look at trends in Duterte-related posts. And this one is a series of events, like two events. First was when ABS-CBN was told to shut down. And then you can see that the positive posts, this is positive towards Duterte-related posts, like Pro Duterte. They were kind of celebrating the ABS-CBN shutdown. Meanwhile, there was also talks about the Anti-Terrorism Act, and the anti-Duterte posts were focusing on that, the Anti-Terrorism Act. So those are for the trends. Now we want to look at the correlation of group sentiments, because that's one way for us to measure polarization. So maybe you have this idea already that if you're pro Duterte, you're probably going to be anti Robredo, and vice versa. If you're pro Marcos, you're going to be probably anti Robredo, and vice versa. And that's actually what we're seeing here. So this chart supports that idea. So going up the chart is sentiment in favor of Robredo. Going to the right is sentiment in favor of Marcos. And we want to focus on these areas. So these first areas show the orange bubbles. These bubbles are groups. So each bubble is a group. So we have here like Lenny Robredo groups. You have here Bongbong Marcos United groups. And interestingly is you can really find groups that are anti-Marcos and pro-Robredo, the orange ones here to the left. And then the orange groups at the bottom, those are the pro-Marcos, anti-Robredo. And there is a scarcity of groups that are pro-Marcos and pro-Robredo. Now, if you compare pro-Robredo versus pro-Duterte, we find a similar picture. There's scarcity of groups that are both pro-Robredo and pro-Duterte. It's kind of rare. And you can see like there are definitely groups that are pro-Robredo but anti-Duterte, and anti-Robredo and pro-Duterte. And interestingly, if you go back, there's a bunch of groups here that are anti-Marcos, generally just anti-Marcos, and then generally just anti-Duterte, and not anti-Duterte, anti-Robredo. So those are the red bubbles. Here you see a large red bubble, a large chunk or cluster of red bubbles that are generally just anti-Duterte. And finally, we looked at pro-Marcos versus pro-Duterte sentiment. And contrary to what we saw earlier, now we're seeing that there are bubbles or groups that are both pro-Duterte and pro-Marcos. And there is now a scarcity of groups that are anti-Marcos and pro-Duterte, and anti-Duterte and pro-Marcos. So it kind of confirms like what we've been feeling on social media. Now, we also analyzed the two types of political groups. So we found two types of political groups. And there are political groups that were politically consistent over time. So you can see here the number of users and whether or not they were talking about politics. And you can see here that consistently it's around 40%, 35%. And then you have here those users who talk about politics initially like 40% of the time, but then it kind of drops. And because of the COVID pandemic, they were replaced by buying and selling, food and delivery. So 1,200 Facebook groups were politically stable. So it means they were highly political despite the shocks due to COVID. And so maybe you can imagine that the purpose of these groups really was to share about politics. Now, these groups on the right, around 1,800, they immediately or they easily turned to pandemic-related topics. So they easily deprioritized politics. And there are possibly many explanations for this, and we don't know exactly their answer. So one possible explanation is this an indicator of organic behavior? Like, because these are real people, and so if there's a shock, let's say from COVID, they turn their priorities, they change their priorities because they're real people doing these things. And they're not like machines that are, that has the objective of just keep on churning politics regardless of whatever's going on in the world. Or maybe it's an indication of lack of conviction. Maybe these were supposed to be political groups. It's just that they didn't have a lot of conviction about that political belief in the first place, among others. So we can probably think of other hypotheses for why these are the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing, but these are what we're seeing. Now that we can categorize the groups into those politically stable and politically unstable, we can now look at the proportions of posts coming from politically stable or politically consistent and proportion of posts coming from politically declining groups. And we can see here interesting trends. For example, in terms of pro or positive sentiment, in terms of positive posts towards Robredo, Marcos, or Duterte, we're seeing that for Marcos and Duterte, more and more posts were coming from these politically declining groups, especially with the COVID lockdown. So in terms of negative sentiment, we see a different kind of pattern that it's actually more pronounced for Robredo-related posts and Marcos-related posts. So anti-Robredo and anti-Marcos posts came more and more from these politically declining groups over time, especially with the COVID lockdown. So we don't know exactly why they're politically declining like that, but so it could be that because it could be an indicator that they're an organic group, or maybe it is an indicator of lack of conviction to the politics. But what we're seeing is there's some sort of pattern there, and I think this warrants further analyses. And finally, we want to show you the most dominant groups that are related to Marcos, Duterte, and Robredo. So we want to focus on Marcos-related groups first that were, politically consistent. So On the left are the pro-Marcos groups that were politically consistent, meaning stable over time. And then on the right are anti-Marcos groups. You can see that most of the pro-Marcos groups had political names, except for one, which was Real Philippine History. So if you think about that, it doesn't sound political at all. It sounds like an educational channel because it's about Philippine history. But it turns out the group Real Philippine History is a pro-Marcos group. In terms of anti-Marcos groups, most of them are again political sounding, but some of these groups have non-partisan or non-political sounding names. For example, Freedom Wall, Original, and Opinion Tunay. Like if you think about it, they don't sound like partisan groups at all. And this particular group, though, Get Real Philippines Community, is actually, from further investigation, because I was validating as well these results, it's actually a pro-Marcos group. It's just that Marcos-related posts were usually tied up with negative sentiment or negative kind of posts, but they're generally pro-Marcos. Now, in terms of the politically declining groups, these are the top politically declining groups related to Marcos. So again, the pro-Marcos groups were mostly political. The anti-Marcos were mostly pro-Robredo or anti-Duterte, anti-Marcos, except for these non-partisan sounding groups, which is Pulso ng Pilipino and Political Forum. But most of them are political sounding. So in terms of Duterte-related posts, most are political sounding, except for there we go again. We see again Real Philippine History, and it turns out it's not only pro Marcos, it's also pro Duterte. And you see also here a seemingly non-partisan group, which is Tulfo Brothers Worldwide. It turns out to be a pro Duterte group. There are a bunch of non-partisan sounding groups that are anti-Duterte, like Freedom Wall, Opinion Publico, Opinion Tunay, and there's also Freedom Wall there. Here are some more groups. So these are from the politically declining kind of groups. We have, again, pro-Duterte groups were mostly Duterte or Marcos groups. And anti-Duterte groups were mostly pro-opposition or anti-Duterte groups, except for this particular group, which is political freedom supporters. And interestingly, they have negative posts towards Robredo and towards Duterte as well. So there's a mix of posts there. So there are people there with negative posts toward Robredo and people with negative posts towards Duterte. And so finally, we go to Robredo-related posts. So the most positive, politically consistent groups were mostly pro-Robredo sounding. Now, there are some groups here that were actually anti-Robredo. It's just that when they use Robredo, like when they refer to Robredo, they use sarcasm. And so the sentiment model mistakenly inferred sarcasm to be positive sentiment. And for anti-Robredo, most are anti-Robredo sounding, but there are non-political or non-partisan sounding groups, and there's a lot. So including, again, Real Philippine History and Tulfo Brothers Worldwide. These two groups, Harry Roque sa Senado and Real Philippine History, were the key sources of the two anti-Robredo bursts, the peaks of negative sentiment in November and January. And finally, these are the politically declining pro-Robredo groups. And again, you have here anti-Robredo groups actually that used sarcasm. So they were like tagged as positive sentiment, but it's actually sarcastic. And some anti-Robredo groups here that were politically declining, you have here, interestingly, for example, Seniors United for Naga, This is actually an anti-Robredo group, Opinion Publico No Bias, and OFW Jeddah KSA chapter. It's an anti-Robredo group. And again, here, political freedom supporters, they have like anti-Robredo and anti-Duterte posts. Now, here's an example of a fake news. So if you zoom into this particular group, OFW GMA Jeddah, you will notice there's a lot of fake news. And so here's just an example, which is talking about yung nakatagong ari-arian ni Leni Robredo. Apparently meron siya nakatagong ari-arian. And these are the key sources of bursts of anti-Robredo posts. So there's a lot of groups here that were responsible for those bursts in November and January 2020. So in summary, there were large bursts of posts for anti-Robredo posts, but also for pro-Marcos posts. And these were driven by political events. Polarization exists for Robredo, Marcos, and Duterte. So pro-Robredo versus pro-Marcos and Duterte groups, they were more polarized. And then pro-Marcos and pro-Duterte groups, they were less polarized, they were more aligned. And we had two types of groups based on political activity. We had politically consistent and politically declining. And more posts were coming from politically declining groups post-COVID lockdown. Are these organic behavior? Are these signals of organic behavior? Or is just that it's lack of conviction? Though note that most of these politically declining groups had political names. So they were initially made to be political, but they weren't able to sustain their political activity. And the most dominant groups had political or partisan names, but there were non-political or non-partisan sounding groups. So for anti-Robredo, anti-Duterte, you can find like non-partisan or non-political sounding groups. So in two of the groups that stood out are these, Tulfo Brothers Worldwide, because it's like it was pro-Duterte, anti-Robredo, it has a non-partisan name. And the Real Philippine History, it was pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos, anti-Robredo, also partially responsible for the bursts of anti-Robredo protests, anti-Robredo posts. So these are two most dominant. These are two interesting groups that stood out, among others. So yeah, that finishes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prince, for your presentation. I think for us, we really saw a lot of activities coming from groups online that were posting political content. So I think one question would be, because what I found very interesting was the nature of the groups, and like what you said, the use of non-political names versus political sounding names. What impact would that have on a user? Is it that people are more likely to join groups that have non-political names?
I don't have the data or analysis to conclude, but I think like intuitively, so I can maybe answer from intuition that intuitively, so it sounds like the group is less biased if it doesn't have a political sounding name. So so you kind of remove the bad reputation of bias. So I think it's a convenient cover for political posts, political propaganda. If you're hidden behind a curtain that sounds unbiased, for example.
All right. And my other question, because a lot of Facebook users, including people who are watching right now, may be part of groups like this unknowingly. So what are maybe things that people can watch out for, kind of like red flags when they become part of a Facebook group? What are some ways that they can tell that, oh, maybe this group is not really being used for the purpose it says it it for. So what are mga like red flags na okay, I think this might be used to manipulate me?
So one red flag, so this is based on like my experience as well and looking at the data. One red flag is if they keep on talking about either very negative or very positive towards a, a political figure. If they consistently talk about a political figure like negatively, highly negatively, or highly positively, then that is a red flag for you. That's an indicator that this is probably an echo chamber. Because I've seen certain groups, like from my analyses, um, I showed you earlier a particular group, and that particular group had a mix of anti Robredo, anti Marcos, and all that. So those are the groups where like people with different ideas and different political beliefs, they post things. But once you find that a lot of the posts are becoming one-sided, then I think that's a red flag.
Right. And I think one step beyond, if you are a group admin, for example, what are things that you can practice within Facebook groups to ensure that your conversations are not getting hijacked by people with political agendas?
As a group admin, well, okay, I have no data to back this up, right? So this is like my personal opinion. Well, you have to be aware of the current events. For example, like you have to yourself be aware, be able to tell fake news from not fake news, for example. And that requires critical thinking, that requires awareness of events that's happening, and digital literacy. Like if you see something like a post that claims an event, a politician did something, you have to have like the ability to check that, to find references and and other sources of facts that can and triangulate, that can help you confirm if that's correct, if that's fake news, or maybe it's a fact. So critical thinking, ability to fact check, I think those are important skills so that you don't accidentally approve fake news. And research has shown that fake news spreads really fast. So if you make a mistake, then you don't know what will happen to a particular piece of fake news.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Javier, for sharing your presentation this morning and for sharing your time as well and thoughts. I like your disclaimer also when you answer and you say that this is an opinion, not based on data. So I think that's really good practice actually now as individuals. We really have to carefully think, am I saying something that's based on personal opinion or facts? So thank you for that, for being a good role model in terms of how we answer questions. So thank you again. As mentioned, we have three research reports that we will be presenting today. So for those of you that have watched Professor Javier's presentation, again, this recording will remain online. So if you want to go back to anything, you will be free to do so. And you're also free to share that in your own networks. So we'll be moving on to our second research presentation for this morning. We have two authors that will be presenting. So this next research report is really was created despite the controversies. Marcos Jr. supporters and his campaign strategists continue to deploy the image of the windmills as a key symbol of his campaign. So let's look at how the appeal of these images resonate with the edifice complex of the Marcos family and their golden age grand narrative. So I'm sure a lot of us have been seeing all those campaign materials with the windmills. So what impact does that have? So the title of this research report is Building Narratives, Stories of Greatness and Windmills in Marcos Jr.'s Campaign Media. So we have two authors joining us today to present this. We have Professor Daphne Tatiana T. Canlas. She teaches at the Department of Broadcast Communication at UP Diliman, and her research interests include the rhetorics and phenomenology of everyday life and the politics of media representation. identity, and post-colonial cultural studies, children's media, and audiovisual production. So her latest publication is entitled "You Know You're Filipino When Nostalgic Tropes of Filipino-ness in YouTube Videos by Second-Generation Filipino Americans." This was um, so she's one of the authors for this one, and also joining us today is the co-author of this report, Professor Ivy A. Claudio. She teaches at the Department of Broadcast Communications as well in UP Diliman, and she teaches courses in radio production, broadcast journalism, media studies. Her research interests revolve around questions concerning the media, international policy, and disasters. She was DZUP station manager from 2015 to 2017, and her latest publication is entitled "The Role of Local NGO in International Disaster Risk Reduction Regime." So this was published in the Filipinas Journal of Philippine Studies Association. Ivy is the current college secretary of the College of Mass Communication. So welcome on screen, Professor Daphne and Ivy, and you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Happy, and magandang umaga sa ating lahat. So our presentation is about the use of the Bangi windmills, no, by a particular campaign video, one of the main campaign videos used by Bongbong Marcos, no, Senator Marcos. And what we did here was a textual analysis of that video. And we wanted to underscore how these narratives built over time, no, and very casually also, does so with the deft use of story, the accessible platforms we have online, and the emphasis they place on these images that turn into symbols, no, that become filled with meaning, and shared media content cements yung narratives that the Marcos Jr. campaign has perpetuated, no, linking it back to the past and situating it in the present. It's interesting because we can actually read buildings as metaphors, no, and architecture in general, and our experiences with them and how they appear to us on our landscape, no, our physical landscape, helps us build meaning. Kasi we interact with them in many different ways, no. We in fact read them as texts, no. We remember them, we imbue them with meaning, and they become intricate meaning networks that are called texts. Hindi siya yung text sa phone, hindi siya yung text lang sa libro, but texts become this complex site, no, of meaning making, na dun naka-house yung ating mga kwento, yung ating mga experiences, tsaka yung sense natin of how we build our knowledge, no. In media, symbols in the form of sound, images, and in this case, with the building, no, yung windmill, they become texts that we live with and use to organize our knowledge of the world. We communicate with them, and we use them to represent complex ideas, feelings, and even histories. So we have here some concepts and some theories about how buildings are actually communicative, no, from Gerard Lico, Chulila Dismaki, and Devan Sujic, who all look at buildings and how they actually communicate meaning to us. So we studied a campaign video of Senator Bongbong Marcos. Prof. Ivy will talk about it a little bit.
So actually, this campaign video is one, I think, of the earliest released campaign videos of Marcos Jr. So in this particularly, we chose the first 6 frames of this video. So what's shown are the windmills, and then and then using the strategy of foregrounding, Marcos Jr. is shown towering over the windmills. He then turns and blocks one of the windmills from the ground, and it transforms into a toy or a pinwheel, or a spinning pinwheel, and then he reaches outside the frame and the shots will cut to the different people receiving the pinwheel. For example, this one, yung boy na binigay niya yung pinwheel niya. And for those who have watched this video, we know that the pinwheel was transferred from one person to another, and I think representing different sectors of society, different sectors of society, workers, individuals, but the message, the message being passed on also primarily is yung sa voiceover. May kabuhayan, may kinabukasan dahil sabay-sabay tayong lahat mabangon. So these sentences are heard in the video. And then at the last part of the video, the ad will end with him saying his name and his campaign slogan, Bangon Bayan Muli, okay, which will appear also across the frame. So when we watch this video, and also along with the other materials relating to the Bangi windmills, which are available in various social media posts also of the campaign team of Marcos, we actually asked, because we know that this is a contentious project, yung Bangi windmill, pertaining to what is really the role of Marcos Jr. In this project. There were a lot of fact checks done about his role, okay, in the windmill project, and also there are also counter fact check done by the Marcos Camp about this. But when we were conceptualizing our paper, one of the questions really was, despite all of this, all of this noise, all of these questions, concerns about his role, about his role on this project, why make it, the centerpiece of his campaign? Because we know that many of his campaign ads, also his campaign pronouncement, really features the Bangi windmill or a symbol of the windmill. Particularly in this campaign ad, for example, they don't even have to label it as Bangi windmill or windmill, because I think we know, right, that it's windmill, and then Marcos is connected to that windmill. So then we asked the question, how it became synonymous with Marcos Jr. despite these controversies, despite these questions, and as I've said, why make it the centerpiece? So in this paper, we argued that the Bangi windmills were used to reinforce the Marcos grand narrative of the golden age using disinformation.
Some of that disinformation led to yung concept ni Gerard Lico on the edifice complex that he studied in 2003 in his book. For him, the edifice complex was used to communicate yung propaganda and ideology of yung greatness ng mga Marcoses. According to Lico, sabi niya, ang goal kasi nung mga building projects ng mga Marcoses was, on the one hand, to fill yung cultural lack ng Pilipinas, na at yung Pilipino mismo na nawala daw nung time ng colonization. Sabi nila, tayo ang gagawa ng bagong sense of culture, so they put into that this idea of grandness, this bigness, na pwedeng maging ang Pilipino. In fact, in his 1965 inaugural speech, Marcos said something, part of his speech said, I will make this country great again. So that greatness was part of the discourse na gusto nilang paigtingin. And something we also found interesting was, very interesting yung idea of concrete and concreteness na in terms of meaning making, ibabaon mo talaga sa memory ng mga tao at marirearrange mo kung paano titingnan yung pamilya nila at yung history that they seem to want to begin with them. No, so this edifice complex and edifices in general is and can be a form of communicating all these attributes that that can be tended to be associated with greatness and with personalities. No, so this is a grand narrative, no, that the Marcoses wanted to perpetuate. And what is a grand narrative? So these grand narratives, the term grand narrative was proposed by the French scholar Lyotard, no? And he said that these are the stories that are seldom, if ever, challenged, and they make a claim to a universal truth. So they are concerned with maintaining a unified story and tend to deny a diversity of views para ma-maintain yung status quo. Like most stories, they also organize our knowledge of history. And what's interesting is they impose a totalizing schema in our minds that informs an ideology, no, of absolutes, of sameness. And there's a sense, no, na there was always a better time, no, and we can go back and revive that again. So parang ganun yung isang gustong gawin ng mga kwento ng kagalingan, no, communicated through these edifices.
And so as Dr. Canla said, we actually tried to make sense, diba, of that grand narrative, because sabi nga namin, when we were examining the videos and also some of the posts about the Bangi windmill, parang we have to ask, diba? Parang what is the impact of that, for example, on Marcos' campaign or Marcos Jr. campaign or on his winnability, for example. But it's very difficult to measure that quantitatively, right? But I think beyond also that, we have to ask the question what are those narratives or those, sabihin na nating, claims or those connections are doing towards the discourses of the everyday, diba? Because in what we're actually one of the things that we're arguing actually is, as I have said earlier, is that the Bangi story is actually reinforcing the grand narrative of a Marcos golden age. Parang, it's connecting to that story because the Marcos golden age, one of the claims, right, is economic prosperity. And we have seen over time. Okay, we have seen over time how they try to revive through media also, diba? Yung iba't ibang mga claims, how yung infrastructure, the infrastructures that were built during that time, the great mga buildings, diba? But they are devoid of context na how gaano ba kadami yung inutang natin doon, ano ba yung impact ng mga edifices na yon, or kunyari, di ba, yung nagkaroon ng aksidente, for example, may mga namatay na tao. So they are already devoid of context. But what we're seeing right now is resurrecting this Marcos golden age is when you see in social media, especially when you follow, for example, some videos on YouTube or even on Facebook, they just tell you that, these are the buildings, ito yung numbers, ito yung nagawa ni Marcos, ito yung ganyan, but lacking nga po ng context. And because of this, what they are really trying to do is to, again, diba, parang to inception, or hindi naman, parang sabihin na the Marcos family were conceptualizers and implementers of infrastructure projects and architectural marvels that uplifted the Filipino culture and improved the quality of Filipino lives. And this is similar to what is also being shown okay, doon sa ilang mga nakita namin sa social media on how, for example, the Bangui windmill is being presented on social media. Like it's sustainable energy, it reduced the amount of yung cost ng electricity, and it's always superimposed doon sa image nga po ng ni Marcos Jr. And these claims to great structures are offered as proof of a Marcos Golden Age when Filipinos were said to have a better quality of life, were more disciplined, respected each other, and were respected globally. And in turn, today also, the Bangui windmills are the subject in images and videos in conversations with Marcos Jr.'s. His supporters claim that he initiated the project and helped reduce energy costs in Ilocos Norte. And as I've said, in other claims also, that he's a champion, for example, of sustainable energy, and that he can also do this in other parts of the country. So those are some of the claims that resurrected in social media and are widely shared also of many of his Facebook groups.
Okay. All right. So how does this connect to this information? No? What we saw was these small stories, these pieces of disinformation actually helped rebuild those narratives and made it very everyday. They made it very, parang naging household na kwento, household name na siya. And they played the long game, through subtle conditioning sa mga media materials na nilalabas nila over time. Shared casually din online yung mga stories ng mga tao, and their experiences, nadalian na i-connect doon sa images ng windmills. And when people talk about it, nasasama yung pangalan ni Marcos Jr. Na yun, through time and yung paulit-ulit at mabilis na pag-spread nitong mga kwento, because they were able to attach it to experiences, normalized the association with Marcos Jr. and the windmills. So, madali ring na revive yung connection to that golden age na, ito ginawa ng pamilya nila ito. So they can definitely do it again. And we can go back to the time where we felt a sense of greatness, respect for ourselves, and a sense of prosperity, for the Philippines compared to today.
Go ahead. Sorry. And remember also that the Bangui windmill, it's also not just a structure. And I think that is also one of our realization when we were doing this study, because they are architectural structures, they are infrastructures. You can actually go there. You can actually visit that place. You can experience that place. So many of people actually post about the Bangui windmill, and then tell them na napakaganda naman dito sa Ilocos, and then so they actually have experienced that, and then it will go through or it will be posted on social media, so other people will chime in, and then there will be engagement, and there will be people also sabi nga parang connecting towards that particular narrative, and in also another thing also is yung pagiging organic din nung content, aside from there's really this yung parang the campaign itself, okay, or the campaign itself of Bongbong Marcos, they have their own strategy, but there are also parang organic content that came from followers who experience actually how it is to see the Bangui windmill or to visit the spaces.
So sharing this through media and social media, we turn to some theoreticians about ano ba tong nangyayari kapag yung isang bagay ay nade-deploy bilang simbolo lang, na parang tila hindi buo yung kwento, Si Walter Benjamin ay nagsulat noon tungkol sa power ng film and photography, for instance, na sabi niya, pwedeng ilapit kasi yung mga bagay na yun, yung mga lugar na yun sa mga tao. At ang natitira ay yung attributes niya na parang, kunyari, napakaganda, napakalaki, no? Kaya lang, yun yung natitira, yung naalala ng mga tao. At dahil yun lang yung naalala, ang tendency ay nakakalimutan yung history at yung authenticity nung bagay na yun. Paano ba yun nag-emerge? What did it take to create that, no? So a lot of, well, in particular, he was writing about Hitler, no? Sabi niya, si Hitler ginagamit niya yung film and photography, no, para i-underscore yung pagiging leader niya, yung pagiging great niya, no, and he was afraid that kapag tinali lang ito sa isang personality, nagkakaroon ng malakas na paraan para gawin itong propaganda. And today, no, because we have electronic and digital reproduction, unprecedented yung accessibility at yung opportunity na mag-access at mag-consume ng media, pati yung pag-create and disseminate nito. Nung nawala yung gatekeepers, parang nagkaroon ng this free flow, no, of information and opportunity to create their own stories and engage in dialogue. Na-democratize nga yung pag-create at yung pag-share, yung pag-disseminate ng media, pero wala pa na-democratize din, no, yung pag-share ng malinformation. Kapag walang matatag na facts, kapag walang verifiable information, dun nagkakaroon ng problema sa mga kwentong lumalabas.
And so to go back again with to the windmill and also to the campaign ad, if you can see the screenshots of some of the supporters of Marcos Jr. on FB, for example, the first slide, yung alam mo ba, this was actually one of the earliest posts, I think, claiming that the Bangi windmill is one of the projects of Marcos Jr. when he was governor in 1998 to 2007. And the Bangi windmill was developed around 2005 by the private company. And then, of course, after it was widely circulated about the Bangi windmills, and then some fact checkers issued fact checks that it is not a project or funded by the Marcos family. And then now some of their supporters are actually fact checking the fact checkers, telling or posting that Marcos didn't really claim that he was the initiator or that he was the funder of the project. Parang they were actually issuing parang another fact check to the fact checker. So that's what's the conversation also about the Bangi windmills right now. But I think as we have said, the pertinent question really right now is that does it seem to matter anymore that about yung conversation kung sino ba talaga yung nagpalagay ng proyekto or ano ba talaga yung rule dito ni Marcos? Kasi nga ang nangyari ay parang naging synonymous na yung Bangi windmill sa pangalan ni Marcos Jr. Parang right now, even if he was, he supported the project 1998 to 2007 when he was governor, but until now, 2022, his name is still attached to the Bangi windmills. So the Bangi windmills become synonymous with Marcos Jr.'s accomplishment. It is something that he can claim as his own, while at the same time reinforcing the idea that the Marcos are great implementers of development. So parang similar to his father through infrastructure projects. And the use of windmills as an icon by Marcos Jr. is a metaphor for development. And now, this is being deployed, as we have said, doon sa kanyang presidential campaign.
ito nga, just to underscore what Professor Claudio said, the deployment of the symbol became second nature. Na-occupy na sa minds ng tao yung golden age narrative niya at unchallenged na siya. So yung mga supporters, hindi na sila tatanggap ng alternative views, which is mahirap baklasin kasi nga, that's how they organized, how they know about history, about these places, and about the Marcos family. So, what does this show us? No? May mga challenges tayong hinaharap. And a couple of things that we wanted to put forward was not so much a prescription, but we can also make this a question. No? It's parang, how do we help people connect the dots and learn about context surrounding issues? Kasi kapag kwento na, kapag stories na ang kaharap mo, stories kasi they not only provide you with information, they also can change hearts and minds, di ba? Especially pag tinali na yan sa experiences ng mga tao. How do we tell stories that can resonate with these people? To make them see that there are other conditions and not just what we see. Hindi lang yung figure na yon, no? Yung isa din naming iniisip is how do we tell the small stories, no? Kasi yung disinformation and malinformation made use of stories but with some claims na were questionable. So how can we tell better stories that are contextualized and localized para makuha yung history, no, we can tell it in the context of history, so that we can change those grand narratives and revive and work towards what we see is a national conversation, no, towards reestablishing a shared reality. Siguro sa ating mga academics or sa ating mga nagsusulat sa mga storytellers, no, that is our challenge, and marami na rin ng nag-step up sa challenge na yon. In the age of media sharing that has become very accessible and very easy, what new strategies can we do? What new images can we deploy? What new production techniques? What new images, sounds, no, can we use to tell the stories that are contextualized and that are localized, and that can help provide perhaps even just a more holistic kwento about how these structures came up, how these events happen, para laging nakatali sa empirically verifiable information and facts yung mga kinukwento natin. But at the same time, resonate with the audiences we're trying to reach. So, yun po. Dun po nagtatapos ang aming sharing, ang aming kwento.
Thank you very much, Daphne and Ivy. Very, very interesting reading of infrastructure and buildings as text. I think a lot of us now really see the impact of that, lalo na sa mga in the comment section when you see it being translated into people's opinions, wherein they say, it's okay that he did all these crimes because he was able to build this infrastructure anyway. And also napaisip ako about the film center and what kind of symbol that actually is. I think that's the perfect metaphor for them. So we have a few questions from the audience here. So given your analysis of the grand narrative that was crafted by the Marcos camp, in terms of a campaign strategy, do you think this was a well-planned strategy? And a follow-up to that, can this sort of grand narrative model be used as well to promote things like good governance, inclusive governance? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. For sure, it was a well-planned strategy, Noemi, because Kita nyo naman, 2015 pa lang ginagamit na nila, di ba? And even if you go way, way, way back in the YouTube archives, you will see as early as the 2010s, marami ng interviews ang lumalabas. Very casual, dinadrop lang yung salitang windmills, banggi, ganyan. And it's built over time. So very well planned and even very well produced, I would say. Very glossy production, but that's for another analysis. And then what was the other question?
How can we use the same
How can we use
the grand narrative for other things, let's say to promote good governance or anti-corruption advocacies?
Yeah, that's the complexity of the grand narrative kasi kapag kapag grand narrative ang sinasabi doon ay isang narrative lang. Ang sinasabi ng grand narrative, dapat walang isang grand narrative, dapat marami. Dapat multiple, di ba? Para hindi iisang kwento lang ang nananaig, di ba? How do we use it? We tell what happened while it was being built, for instance, di ba? There's one example. May isa pang windmill farm sa Ilocos, the Pagudpod windmill farm, di ba? I looked it up. Marami ring mga kwento online about, folks posting selfies. Ay, ang ganda dito, so majestic, etc., etc. But then when you go back in time and you look at stories of anong nangyari during the process of putting up the Pagudpod windmills, ang dami pa lang mga taong na nasalanta nung pag-clear nung area to put them up, no? Maraming nawalan ng bahay, may mga nawalan ng hanap buhay. In fact, there were protests against the Pagudpod windmills. So yun, hindi masyadong nagkukwento yun eh. So can we look at the stories of those people who were actually affected and not just always retell na, oh, ang ganda, ganyan, ang galing na part na tayo ng kwento ng sustainable energy sa mundo, yung mga ganun. It's not all pretty, di ba? There are other stories that exist. There are other ways that people were affected by these wonderful and these majestic structures. What are those? So, maganda na maraming kwentong ganon. And in our paper, we say na messy siya, maraming kwento, no? It's so hard to make sense of everything, pero that's what reality is eh. It's messy, iba-iba. Minsan nagko-collide yung mga beliefs at yung mga kwento at yung mga experiences, but because we have the ability to have these conversations and engagements, we can use that for good and try to have those exchanges and learn that people are coming from different contexts. We have to respect and accept that they have different experiences. And the next step of the work is, okay, how do we navigate that now? How do we come to a shared reality where kaya nating mabuhay together with all of these contradictions that are facing us?
And to add,
yeah, go ahead.
Din po siguro, I think ito kasi yung gusto sana, isa din sana sa gusto namin gawin ni Ma'am Data in this study, but we didn't have time also, is to really look at in terms of strategy, how are they parang making use, diba, when you look at the content, for example, on social media, YouTube, TikTok, for example, these are people, these are unknown people, these are ordinary people, parang creating content, but they are more believable. If you look at the engagement, if you look at how people comment on their Facebook pages when they talk about the Marcoses parang achievements, diba? Marcos Senior and also Marcos Junior. So they really gather a lot of engagement, but at the same time, they also foster a lot of parang cynicism towards talaga traditional media. And I think that's also one great or one strategy that they employed to be able to come out or to be able to cement this narrative or these narratives in this campaign in this campaign. So yun po.
And one more question, just for the interest of time, because we have another presentation, but there are many questions about your work. Very interesting. I think, can you illustrate or give an example of, so if a grand narrative is the kind of storytelling or framework wherein we don't see a diversity in voices, right? We only hear one person, it's not very inclusive. What does the opposite look like? Or what other successful ways of storytelling or strategies have you seen that has a more inclusive and a diverse way of telling that story, of spreading those same ideas, pero in a different framework that's not the grand narrative?
I tend to turn to yung yung grand narrative ng identity, na dalawa lang ang identity sa mundo, babae at lalaki, 'di ba? Okay, to answer your question, ano yung counter framework doon is to tell the contextualized story. Nagkaroon ako ng blank moment. But what I wanted to get at was, if you look at the way that yung kwento ng gender, no, through the years, through the decades, came about, yung kwento na dalawang klase lang yung gender sa mundo, na nabasag yun di ba? And so people started telling their own experiences, telling their own stories, and they did it in very creative ways. They started using the symbol of the rainbow, for one, diba? To show that there's a spectrum, diba? There's a spectrum of stories, there's a spectrum of genders, actually. They changed the discourse, they changed the words we use, they repurposed words, no? Para maipakita at maihatid na if you continue to use kasi yung language na yon, dun din tayo mauuwi, no? We had this thought experiment, no? What if I told you, for instance, that, or what if I was told, for instance, that actually data, hindi ka babae, you are actually a plant, diba? Your gender is a plant. And so that kind of tells you, what? All this time, I've been deceived. And so it's hard to wrap your head around that. Your gender is a plant. So what does that mean? How do I show that, diba? How do I now express the story of being a plant, but also being data, diba? If you take a look at the way that yung kwento ng gender happened, they started deploying colors differently, no? They started using colors differently. They owned various representations of themselves. They started using media in a different way, telling different stories from different angles na akala natin hindi pwede, no? But most of all, they had the courage to break through yung mga standards na nilapat sa pag-iisip na dalawa lang ang gender sa mundo at ito lang ang pwede mong gawin at ito. Yun. So, mahaba at malalim na discussion, no? But we can have an offline discussion some more. But yun ang pinaka-accessible for me right now na pwede kong ikwento in terms of not grand narratives ang lumalabas.
Anything to add for you, Prof. Claudio?
Ako siguro, kasi hindi pa natin ito nagawa masyado, pero yung representation ng Filipino identities na I think ngayon kasi nakikita natin yon na there are different and differing Filipino identities and they are being showed or showcased on media kahit papaano ngayon sa kampanyang season na ito. And I think that's a start. And hopefully we'll be able to see that in the coming days, or in the coming years. Because I think one of the concerns really for our culture or for our country is we always look for that grand narrative. Now, what is the Filipino? We always romanticize that, even media. But I think we really have to also emphasize and fight for that representations. Now, we have different identities as Filipinos, so we don't have to look for that grand narrative in our culture, in governance, for example. So I think that's for my opinion also. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Very rich discussion, and I think a lot of people have questions. So, pero again, we are limited by time. Tatlo ang presentation natin today. So again, thank you very much, Prof. Claudio, and to Dr. Data. So just for those who are watching, that is your nickname kasi baka malito sila na we were talking about data. So thank you for joining us this morning and giving us an idea, how to understand these symbols and metaphors that are being fed to us, and that, we continue to tell these small stories that are all a part of who we are as Filipinos and as individuals. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. And again, for those of you who are only tuning in right now, this is the Facts First PH research briefing. This will be the last one before elections. So we've been doing this for the past how many weeks. We did this on a weekly basis, and really what we wanted to do with the research briefings was really to kind of really help us understand what's going on, uplifting the discourse so that we understand really the many ways that we're being manipulated online without us knowing. So that is really the purpose of the research briefing. We bring academics, scholars, and experts to the table for them to share all the research and the data that they have gathered and what insights they have picked up from the research that they have conducted. So yan po talaga ang purpose ng research briefing, for us to learn. I know it's not very common for you to see this in a news site that, this is very academic, but I think in Facts First PH, we really value the input of researchers and academics who go through the rigorous studies for us to have better understanding of our online landscape right now. So we move on to the final research presentation for this morning's research briefing. The last research work is premised on the observation that misogyny, the intense prejudice against and contempt for women, has become more ferocious in cyberspace in the recent years, particularly against those critical of President Rodrigo Duterte, and now during the lead up to the 2022 election. So 3 days na lang, it's election time now. On Monday, we're all going to be casting our vote. So just a disclaimer before we proceed to this presentation, disclaimer and trigger warning to our viewers. So this presentation will contain profanity and graphic images. So that is because those are the things that were put out there. Those were the things that were analyzed. So disclaimer lang and trigger warning for those of you that are watching. Some of those images will be flashed during the presentation. So the title of the work is Cyber Misogyny and Human Rights. The author of this work is Professor Elizabeth Enriquez. She is a professor in the College of Mass Communication in UP Diliman, where she teaches media history, media theory, political economy of media, media literacy, and gender and sexuality. She's the author of the book Appropriation of Colonial Broadcasting, A History of Early Radio in the Philippines, 1922 to 1946, and the monograph with video documentary Radio, an essay on Philippine radio in CCP 2003. So both pioneering and still the only extensive works on Philippine broadcast history. She was a Fulbright Scholar twice, in 2001 and 2002, and her research on historical periods of Philippine broadcasting media and gender and media education has been published in several reference journals and book anthologies, and produced in audiovisual formats like documentaries and online lectures. So I'd like to invite on screen with me Professor Elizabeth Enriquez. Welcome.
Maraming salamat, Happy. Gaya ng nasabi ni Happy, the title of my presentation is Cyber Misogyny and Human Rights. At dahil talagang maselan yung ilang mga salita at mga images na makikita nyo, ulitin ko yung kanyang trigger warning. Meron pong mga salita ditong I assure you I don't use normally, pero kailangan gamitin para sa analysis nitong report na ito. At meron ding mga graphic images na hindi po natin kinukonsinte, ngunit ginamit lamang po para sa analysis, para sa report na ito. Okay, so here goes. The fabricated sex videos posted online purportedly of Aika Robredo and Tricia Robredo, the daughters of Vice President Leni Robredo, are among the recent cases of disinformation circulating in cyberspace that are framed in the vitriol of misogyny. The attack on the young Robredos is obviously an attempt to damage their mother's bid for the presidency. Many are shocked but not surprised, given the increasingly heated campaign in which the only female candidate is perceived to pose a formidable threat to the 9 other presidential aspirants, all male. That the disturbing fakery was not exactly unexpected indicates the alarming yet taken for granted consequence of any form of political engagement by women, both in the real world and in virtual space. This analysis is premised on the observation that misogyny, the intense prejudice against contempt for women, has become more ferocious in cyberspace in recent years, particularly against those critical of President Rodrigo Duterte, and now during the lead up to the 2022 elections. This report analyzes a relatively small but significant sample of the appalling number of misogynistic memes, posts, and comments that fan the flame of misogyny, with an equally sickening number of likes and shares from like-minded users from 2015 to 2020. So I've divided this report into the following. I will be mentioning the following words or phrases: disinformation as cyber misogyny as backlash, online rape in a real world, a real war, and the manosphere. Cyber misogyny violates human rights. And finally, I will issue a call, an action call to address this menace. Okay, the internet claims credit for democratizing access to information and providing the latitude for free speech, but it has also paralleled and echoed the discords and social maladies in the real world. Discourses of hate and humiliation, often abetted by disinformation, structured against the marginalized in the real world, are mirrored online. Discriminated and excluded due to unequal power relations based on class distinctions, race and ethnicity, culture and religion. Of late, the most maligned marginalized sectors are the women and the LGBTQ, but especially the women. The viciousness seems to have risen in proportion and in coincidence with the coming to power of the most misogynistic president Filipinos have had the tragic misfortune of suffering in the last 6 years. And now, with the hotly contested presidential elections at our doorstep, the venom against the female, particularly the high profiles such as female candidates, journalists, activists, and celebrities who boldly express a political opinion, is at its fiercest. Online assaults, such as the cases of the Robredo sisters, bring into sharp focus an epidemic that began long before the COVID-19 pandemic, which is now in its 3rd year. The former, a virulent cycle of backlash against women who advance and gain ground in what has been traditionally taken for granted as the masculine territory of public life, appears to be exacerbated by the latter, a global health crisis that has had a profound impact both on public and private lives. As the pandemic has forced everyone to shift work, study, and social connections online, significantly in the Philippines, where the longest and most stringent lockdown is just beginning to ease up, it has also provided the platform to reverberate offline misogyny on the virtual world. Feminist Backlash, a concept popularized by Susan Faludi in her 1991 critique Backlash, the undeclared war against American women, shudders in indignation every time women's rights and social status expand and displace a cog in the machinery of patriarchy. Women's suffrage, for example, the birth control pill that gave women some measure of power over their bodies, the activist movement against sexual harassment and discrimination, and the enlarging leadership roles of women in politics and economics have all aroused counterattacks from a patriarchal camp that insists that traditional roles of women and men and the unequal power relations that these roles maintain are natural. Faludi writes that this backlash is media-driven. The current intensity of cyber misogyny against Lenny Robredo, Maria Ressa, Laila de Lima, and Jover Laurio, to name just a few, is part of the present-day backlash against women who have dared to challenge masculine power by encroaching on supposedly masculine terrain. Through contemptible language and lies meant to shame, humiliate, impute immorality, however that is defined, threaten with rape, death, and violence, and bullied with baseless accusations, cyber misogyny attempts to silence women who raise their voices to put them back in their place, quote unquote. The attacks are almost always sexualized, but also common are physical insults, offensive name-calling, and attacks against one's intelligence, particularly against journalists and politicians. Since 2016, when Duterte became president, the attacks have mostly come from his supporters, real and bots, but even bots are mobilized by real people. I have several examples here, but I'm not going to read my entire paper on this. Let me just mention a few. One example here is that of veteran broadcast journalist and television news anchor Karen Davila. There were a lot of posts that tried to picture her as stupid, no, using the words palpal and napahiya, meaning embarrassed and humiliated. And obviously the goal is to diminish her experience and credibility. Note that censures are also posted by women, no, such as the one by Duterte supporter Mocha Uson. This reminds us that the presence of women in positions of power does not guarantee the advancement of gender equality. Another example is that of Pia Ranada, no, who has also been on the receiving end of similar posts following her reports on extrajudicial killings that Duterte branded as fake news, no? And you will recall also that Duterte said she gained weight by writing fake news. No? Culturally, we presume that gaining weight is supposed to be unflattering to women. So this was meant to be an insult. Okay, so there's a Facebook user called Crabler, obviously meant to parody Rappler, which reacted with malice to Ranada, taking exception to a violent threat from RJ Nieto, who actually issued a real violent threat, no, that Harry Roque should throw a hollow block on Pia Ranada. We should take note that Rappler is female-led and it has more women than men, the way I looked at the roster, no? In its team, and the online news website Rappler, the first of its kind in the country, has been the object of persecution by the Duterte government, mainly due to its unrelenting coverage of the drug war. So apart from the numerous court cases Rappler has been contending with, Rappler's journalists have also been derogatorily dubbed as college sorority bloggers and Rapplerettes, in effect infantilizing them by using terms that demean their maturity and experience. As we know, infantilization of women is a common means to treat women as immature, thereby diminishing them. The portmanteau terms hornalism and hornalist have been used to describe Rappler as well as journalists critical of Duterte, like award-winning freelance journalist Raisa Robles. No, can we go to the next slide? There, no, and then the next slide. Okay, even the prominent CNN journalist Christiane Amanpour was also called a hornalist. No? So the physical insults hurled against blogger Jover Laurio are brutal. No? So she was not only physically insulted, no, she was also doxxed, a victim of doxing. We know that she was formerly anonymous, but then she filed a case against Pro Duterte bloggers RJ Nieto and Sasasot, whom she accused of violation of the anti-privacy law by doxing her or collecting and publishing personal information about her, including her photographs without her authority and posting them online. No? So Jover was called Fiona Pig in reference to the ogre princess in the animated film Shrek, and also Bakulao, or a beast. No? There were also physical insults thrown at Sister Senator Nancy Binay and Makati Mayor Abby Binay. They were called Pangit and Negra. No? So in fact, Senator Binay was told maghilod, no? Or scrub her skin kasi it's dark, it's black, it's full of dirt. While Laurio and others are insulted for being overweight, Senator Risa Ontiveros is slurred for her slight build. Baliktad naman ito, no? So yung mga may mga Facebook users that ranted at her fake beauty, accusing her of being retocado and accusing her further of charging all her cosmetic surgery to the funds of PhilHealth. Okay, the more spiteful, perhaps, than the attacks against Senator Ontiveros are those against Vice President Leni Robredo. Her performance has been maligned online long before she declared that she was running for president. She has been disparagingly branded as lugaw, literally porridge, but used as a local jargon for lightweight, no? Or lutang, literally floating, but connotes slow-wittedness. And madam, a play on madam and dumb. The brand lugaw was occasioned by her providing porridge to frontliners in the early part of the pandemic, as she worked with a limited budget, while lutang and madam emerged from edited interviews that made her look lacking in intelligence. Despite her office earning the highest rating for 3 straight years from the Commission on Audit, which indicates her office's proper use of public funds, Duterte supporters Lorraine Badoy and Sasasot posted long tirades against her and called her inept and incompetent. Unable to sniff a whiff of corruption in her performance as vice president, bashers posted the most venomous disinformation about her, alleging that she had an extramarital affair while her husband was still alive, while pregnant by a married congressman, and then aborted his child. Until today, posts emerged online claiming that she is carrying on an affair with a married man, dubbed her boylet, local slang for a casual fling, to whom she goes home every night, calling her kabit, which is the local slang for mistress. As mentioned above, her daughters have also become the victims of fabricated sex videos that impugn their reputation. I want to put this warning again because this is, to me, the most objectionable part of the report. Well, not my report, but the images that I used to base this report on. Okay, I find even more savage the attacks on Senator Laila de Lima, former chair of the Commission on Human Rights and Justice Secretary during the term of the late President Noynoy Aquino. A fierce vocal critic of Duterte, de Lima was arrested and has been in jail since 2017 on what are widely believed to be trumped-up charges of drug trafficking. To disgrace her, her private life was dug up at a Senate hearing covered live on television, where her male colleagues questioned her and alleged drug lords who testified against her. Of course, we now know that they are recanting their testimonies one by one, and yet de Lima stays in jail. No? The Senate hearing quickly deteriorated into irrelevant inquiry into her romantic relationship with her former security aide, Ronnie Dayan, allegedly her bagman. The slanderous rhetoric was immediately echoed and exaggerated on social media. Dehumanizing deep fakes of her face in compromising photos and videos were posted online. Indelicate allusions to the male member by using the Saba banana became part of the references to de Lima when she admitted her relationship with Dayan and attributed it to the frailties of a woman. A Facebook user coined the pejorative, frailties of the pekpek or the female organ to refer to her. Other slurs thrown at her include the words with denigrating connotations such as malandi and the variations malantod and maharot or slut, tigulang igat, matandang malandi or old slut, halimaw or monster, and salot or plague. Some Facebook users castigated her, while one even advised her to hang herself. Okay, let me go to the next slide. There are two premises that are proposed here. Okay, the online rape in a real war and the manosphere. First premise is that online rape threats and by extension, death threats and other threats of violence may be considered a form of attempted rape and attempted murder or assault, respectively. In the United States, the National Crime Victimization Survey includes threats of rape, including those made online, as a form of attempted rape and thus taken seriously. The second premise is that the backlash against women is a real war waged in cyberspace. The social media in particular is weaponized against those who resist the traditional patriarchal order. While we may grant that the internet has opened up spaces for women and the LGBTQ who advocate gender equality, the manosphere is also online, instigating sexual harassment, spewing misogynistic fury, and normalizing violence against women. The manosphere, often associated with extreme rightist groups, is a compendium of online sites and forums promoting traditional masculinity and misogyny. Perhaps the social media users in our sample may not necessarily be card-bearing members of the manosphere, but their online behavior of policing women and women's sexuality online and constant sexualization and dehumanization of women reflects the philosophy of the manosphere. Women who appear to challenge the patriarchal tenet that men, with their sexual prowess, are naturally hardwired to be the leaders in society, while women should submit to them, are on the receiving end of online wrath and insults. The power gap justifies the double standard that dismisses as normal and not to be questioned the infidelities of a president who keeps at least one mistress by his own account, while vilifying a female senator in a romantic relationship with a man not her husband. This study sample shows that women journalists, female politicians, and other women in positions of power are targeted online because they appear to disrupt the patriarchal order, inciting the backlash that today is waged largely in cyberspace. A most disconcerting case is of Rappler CEO Maria Ressa. Rappler has been relentless in covering Duterte's drug war and the extrajudicial killings that have been its costly price. Consequently, attacks against Ressa, who last year became the first Filipino Nobel laureate, have been sustained throughout Duterte's term. The death and rape threats poured in unbelievable numbers, but also horrifying was the sarcasm and spite issued by several social media users. Following the publication in late 2016 of the Rappler series titled Propaganda War, Weaponizing the Internet, the threats escalated. She received an average of 90 hate messages an hour. When she was misquoted as saying she received 90 rape threats per minute, a spate of meanness surged in. The hate messages were directed at her looks. The general theme was that she was not good looking enough to be desired, that she was old and had delusions of being a sex object. Her skin was a common object of ridicule, mocked as galis or galis aso or dog mange, kaliskis or scales, and balat ahas or snake skin. This shows how deeply misunderstood is the crime of rape, that it is not about sexual desire, but a violent assertion of power. Studies indicate that rapists are angry at women and will drive to dominate and control them. And since we are on the subject of war, here is an ugly but sobering truth about rape and war. Rape, enforced prostitution, and intentional impregnation have been weapons and strategies of war throughout history. Women's bodies have been used to humiliate the enemy, to avenge a defeat in battle, and for ethnic cleansing. In this online war against women, rape is invoked for the same reason, to humiliate and retaliate against women who dare speak up. In some of the posts, there were also threats against Raisa Robles, also against Kabataan Party List Representative Sara Elago. And in these cases, the rape threats supposedly were wished on them to come from the Maute in the case of Robles and from the NPA in the case of Elago. Also analogous to rape threats online are posts that troll critics with crass, hypersexualized, and inflammatory comments. Example, itong threat against a young female anti-Marcos activist na sumama dun sa rally against the burial of the late dictator in the libingan ng mga bayani. She was called a future porn star, maganda pero buba, and one post suggested a, pardon the expression, the word, a gangbang, while she is muzzled and tied down. W in the next slide, please. In the United Arab Emirates, who killed her employer in self-defense. The employer tried to rape her at knife point and brutally beat her up. And one Facebook user said, dapat in-enjoy mo na lang yung rape, no? So this was, of course, may mga nag-react naman na sinabing this is so insensitive, no? There were also similar taunts against Ranada and Davila, no? The persistent sexualization of women, which reduces their worth to their sexual appearance and behavior while ignoring their other qualities, has not spared Duterte allies such as Mocha Uson, no? So Mocha Uson, I'm sure, pretty sure we've all read a lot about her. She is routinely called whore, prostitute, pasensya na lang po, puta, which is a vulgar term for prostitute in Filipino, pambansang pokpok, and hubadera. Okay, that Uson is frequently reproached for her perceived promiscuity is one way to police women's sexuality. Another is the sneer at Resa's sexual orientation, no? Which is a departure from socially enforced gender relations, as if this has any relevance to one's work or value. No? So the slides show this. No? Cyber misogyny cannot be defended as free speech. The harm it causes are real and are a violation of human rights, women's human rights. Freedom of speech is not absolute, and it can be circumscribed if it produces injury. The oft-cited argument is that misogyny in virtual space undermines democracy. That this type of online abuse tends to have a chilling effect on women's freedom to engage in public discourses in the digital sphere is correct. But the damage is not only to the polity or the public sphere. The cost is greater when we examine the closer and more personal detriment to women who are the subject of misogynistic attacks online. Almost everyone, including women, especially women in politics and media, must today maintain a strong virtual presence to do their jobs. However, they now also endure a threat to their right to work and to just and favorable conditions at work. This slide recalls the banning of Granada from entering Malacanang when her reports displeased its occupant. No? There was a post by Thinking Pinoy that mocked her, saying, ito na lang ang trabaho mo. But it, of course, it also had the side effect of insulting the honest women who are engaged in honest work, no matter what our perceived social stature is of these jobs are. The starker reality is that gendered attacks online deny women a safe space on the digital sphere, affecting their right to work, which is a right that cannot be denied. Everyone has a right to be treated equally and with dignity, regardless of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status, as guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Cyber misogyny is undoubtedly an affront to rights to safety and security, especially considering the traumatic, psychological, and emotional impact on women subjected to sexualized and violent attacks. Published online for everyone to see, a woman's victimization is magnified, particularly when third parties from a cyber mob, which can for many women translate into a real fear that threats of rape and violence online can actually happen offline. Are women pushing back? Yes, to some extent. Some take on the trolls by posting their disgusted replies, as this slide will show, but I'm not going to go into detail. But the misogynistic narratives outnumber the pushback by 100 miles. In a recent interview by Ressa, Vice President Leni Robredo admitted she was wrong to have ignored the disinformation about her online in the beginning of her term as vice president, and that she should have responded to dispel the lies and what she called muck. Her daughters must have learned the lesson as they quickly sought the assistance of the National Bureau of Investigation to look into the fake sex videos. However, the pushback continues to be overwhelmed by the armies of trolls. Both Robredo and Ressa observed that social media platforms have refused self-regulation as they make so much money. To quote Ressa, Robredo sees the solution in legislation that will make social media serving platforms accountable. As Robredo said, it is about time. This will expectedly be a controversial piece of legislation, as critics will sound the alarm against a threat to freedom of speech. Admittedly, a balancing act is required here, but that cannot be used as an excuse to delay action, as so much is at stake here. Apart from local legislation, a new digital social contract is in order through binding international covenants among nations to stop the amplification of cyber misogyny and all forms of disinformation and incivility online. Among the standards the designers of the algorithms must take into account are the very real harms that women contend with online, instead of, as US Congresswoman Jackie Speyer wrote to Facebook on behalf of 100 women legislators from 30 countries, quote, algorithms that reward extreme and dangerous views with greater reach and visibility, creating a fertile breeding ground for bias to grow. Writers Lucina Demeco and Alcy McQuay quote the United Nations Human Rights Council, which states that, quote, the corrosion of women's human rights is a litmus test for the human rights standards of the whole of society, unquote. And Demeco and McKay write, when these standards falter, so do many of the common beliefs, values, and social norms that we take for granted, including freedom of expression for everyone, not only the powerful and the bullies. Non-action is not an option. Marami pong salamat.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Enriquez. I think this was a really a lot to take in, especially if you're a woman right now watching this. Here in Raptor, I can attest to the attacks that you've outlined in your presentation. It is very much a part of our daily lives already, so much so that it's sort of been normalized, like you expect to get attacked, and and very much undermined for the work that we do because we are women. So again, thank you. This was again, it was a lot, I think, to take in, but at the same time, very important also to take stock, because it has been so normalized. All these images have been, things that we are bombarded with on a daily basis without us actually thinking and realizing that, wait a minute, this is an attack on my person. This is an attack that will have offline impact. because they're seeded online and then they turn into real world attacks. So I think my first question would be, given all these attacks with the personalities that you mentioned, these are personalities that are known in the public sphere, but what would you say will be something like the first aid treatment for all these attacks? So once we see these attacks and at the scale that they happen, what would you think would be a good way to kind of counter this, or like the first aid to these attacks?
I know it's very hard, but I think we have to answer back. We have to fight fire with fire. I don't know if that works, and I don't know whether we have the gumption to do it. Kasi ang kailangan talaga sikmurang bakal ka para harapin mo tong mga ito, no? But if you're asking for a band-aid approach, no, so pwede siguro yun muna. Pero I think the call to action is serious, no? There really should be legislation already at the level of states, no? But actually, the states can only do so much, Kasi we all know that the states can only do so much in controlling what circulates in cyberspace, di ba? I know that some governments, the ones that want to control the information flow that reaches their citizens, no, try to control some of these sites, no, but they can only do so much in doing that because there are so many ways to bypass all of these controls. So we have to assume that this is happening worldwide. And I think there has to be an international covenant, no, of sorts, or agreement of sorts to address this. We can address this on a state level, but I think that's not enough. We need to, I don't know whether the United Nations, it's busy doing all sorts of things, but I think it should step in already and do something about this. But the band-aid solution muna, yung umpisa is let's answer back. No, this is going to take so much from us. Okay, I know, because it's so traumatic, and to read it is traumatic already. To answer back pa tapos matotroll ka pa lalong-lalo, no, because of that. Masakit na nga yan sa dibdib, pero lalo pang masakit, no? But we can't let it go, di ba? I'm not sure that is the correct answer, Happy, but that's all I can think of at the moment. Gaya nga sinabi ni Vice President Robredo, di ba? Sabi niya dapat hindi nila pinabayaan. Hindi niya kasi pinansin nung una eh. And that was her policy in the beginning, to just ignore it because it's not the truth anyway. And then she realized later on that they should have done something about it.
And just a follow-up to the proposed call to action that you said about addressing this on a global scale through a covenant or legislation. So given that, assuming that we've been there, what challenges do you foresee we will face when we do get to that point where we already have international agreements and legislations? Do you foresee any challenges at that point in time when we do get there?
Yes, big business, the ones that benefit so much from these platforms, will put up a fight, and it's going to be a messy fight, no? Because why is this allowed online? Because it makes money, no? Tama si Reza, it makes money for the platforms, because the higher the subscription to a particular place, the more effective their advertising becomes, no? And that is a source of income for them, no? And all of these people joining, the cyber mob actually drive up the numbers that they need for the business to expand and to survive, no? So it's big business actually that will put up a fight, no? In the US, ang problema nila kasi nag-liberalize yung control over broadcasting to begin with, no? Yung dati kasi, if you go back in history, there's this antitrust law that actually controlled how big broadcast networks could become, no? And how big any business could become actually, no? But this was, it was deregulated, no? And the process of deregulation actually started several administrations ago. And today, the effect of deregulation can be seen because media organizations have grown without control, such that there are only a handful of global media organizations that are lording it over not only the air, but also cyberspace. So yan ang kalaban. Negosyo.
Kapitalismo. Okay.
Oo, yes.
Yeah. Last question, I think, because we're running out of time. This one was sent in by one of the participants here in the Zoom room. So it seems like, it's out of control. Parang the damage has been done. This has happened in such a grave and great scale. How can we take back the power as women, as individuals? Further to follow up on that, have you seen any successful examples of women taking back the power or emerging behaviors online that you've observed that have successfully allowed women to take control of the narrative again and to take back the power?
I don't know about the rate of success, but there are sites that are fighting back. There are groups of women of many different strands, no? Kasi hindi naman iisang strand yan eh. Who are trying to fight back, no? Kaya lang, they don't have the numbers, no? So right now it's an uphill battle, no? Talagang makikipagbuno tayo ng wagas na wagas para malabanan ito, no? Pero meron pa tayong isang dapat gawin, no? Na ito rin, struggle rin ito eh. And that is media and information literacy. Media literacy, hindi tayo masyadong literate eh. Sa paggamit ng media, no? Kaya madali tayong maniwala sa kasinungalingan, no? Sa mga pambobola, no? So I know that there has been a move actually in our education system to teach media literacy from the high school level pa lang, no? Pero hindi pa ganun katalas yung ngipin nung mga subjects na ito para talagang maituro sa mga bata, no? Kasi dapat mag-umpisa ka ng bata pa lang eh, di ba? Na it's a nasty world out there. This is how you should take, whatever you read, watch, listen to, and in whatever platforms, no? If you ask me, I think we should start media literacy at the kindergarten level, di ba? Doon pa lang, umpisahan na, no? Kasi ngayon, imagine you can see, I don't know, in your families, you probably see this, 1-year-olds, they already know how to navigate, di ba? Online, no? Yung mga apo ko ganun eh. Nagulat ako eh. 1 taon pa lang do marunong nang maghanap nasan nandun yung Disney Channel, no? So they're there already. So we need to start at that level, no? We need to start. But of course this is easier said than done, no? Tsaka lagi na lang inaasahan natin yung mga eskwela to do this, no? The families should also do this. The churches, no? If the church is one important social unit to which people to which people belong, no? So we need that, but we also need the instrument to teach media literacy, no? Right now, yung mga instruments na nakikita ko ay medyo kulang pa sa refinement. So isang trabaho yan na dapat nating harapin. Sabi nga ni Data, ang daming trabaho. Ang daming trabahong dapat gawin. But we need to do it, di ba? And we all need help. All of us, we need help, and we need to help each other.
Okay. At dyan po nagtatapos ang ating research briefing for the day. Thank you very much again, Professor Enriquez, for sharing this. I know, again, it was a lot to take in. We had three research reports to kind of absorb, and hindi na tayo sanay sa ganitong klaseng diskurso in our online conversation. So thank you very much for sharing this. And to all of our viewers and participants here inside the Zoom room, thank you for sitting through the 3 presentations this morning. Again, this is the final Facts First PH research briefing. We will do this again after elections, pero 3 days na lang, malapit na, and election na. So again, Facts First PH, for those of you that were watching and are interested to learn more, you can check out the website factsfirst.ph. Again, all of the recordings of the briefing that we had this morning will be available for you to share and rewatch if you want to go back to any of the data that was shared today. This is exactly why we put it out on air, para we have the time also to look back and understand again, go through the presentations again, because as I said, medyo mabigat siya for us, pero this is very important work, and this is also, you know, one of the reasons why we included a research layer in Facts First PH movement, because we really need to understand, take stock, zoom out, and see the emergent behaviors online today, because this is changing very quickly, and this is also for our own benefit, for our own safety online. So again, thank you very much to all of the authors and researchers that joined us today, to all the Zoom participants watching us, for those of you who are watching through the Raptor platforms and through the cross-posting of our partners in Facts First PH. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Again, factsfirst.ph is the website to go to if you want to learn more about this initiative. So thank you very much, everyone. Good morning.